Welcome back to Gridwise News. I'm Tanya Shepherd, and with me again, once again, is Matt Goldman and Jim Smelley. Today, we're going to talk about a proposal from Governor Greg Abbot that could fundamentally change the way millions of Texans buy electricity. Jim, you brought this to us. You were the first one to find it, so why don't you explain it to us?
Yeah, the simple idea is that when Texas deregulated, they allowed some cities and municipals to choose to stay out of the competitive market and the rest of their competitive market. And it's actually, if I understand correctly, one line in the bill. So all you have to change in order to change the law is to change that one line in the bill. And then every municipal and every city that opted out, like San Antonio and Austin, is suddenly in the competitive market. So legally, it's not a big change at all. Obviously, for those cities and for the competitive market of Texas, having the 10th largest city in the United States, San Antonio, enter a competitive market is a huge deal for the competitive landscape of Texas.
The proposal's really interesting. I think one of the questions, and part of the opponents and proponents of it, is whether competition actually drives lower consumer prices. What do you think, Jim?
Tanya, you and I just recorded a video about the history of deregulation, looking at around the country. And when we did that, I tried to find data showing whether regulation or deregulation has helped the most. And Texas is the best case study. It's the best experimental lab for that, because within the same state, you have both regulated and deregulated space, right? So it's a really good comparison. You don't have to try to go and compare Texas to New Mexico or something. And there's a famous study from the Wall Street Journal from several years ago, pre-COVID and pre-Winter Storm Uri, which is more relevant in our case than COVID, that showed that, in fact, the deregulated parts of Texas had paid substantially more than the regulated parts of Texas. Their prices had increased substantially. But that study's old. It's about 5 years old. And so I did my best effort actually to recreate the study and to try to understand what is happening in Texas and to see if you could find any possible trend. Like, for example, what if we looked at the change in price over the last 5 years in the regulated parts versus the deregulated parts? What if it was speeding up in the regulated parts of the industry? And the reality is there is no data to show that either way. Basically, if you look at San Antonio right now, it's kind of middle of the pack pricing for the state. Its price increases have basically been roughly middle of the pack price increases for the state, kind of trending with the rest. It does have a really unique challenge. Both Austin Energy and San Antonio during Winter Storm Uri, which you could argue is a impact brought on by the competitive market, they had huge cost overruns when they had to purchase power. And so CPL, I think, now owns over $1 billion. And if we do transition into a market like this, somebody owns that debt. Where does that debt go? It isn't a simple economic calculation. Customers will end up paying that somehow. So I think at the end of the day, the politicians who are out talking about this on either side, saying it will or won't increase your prices, I would listen to either side of them. I don't think either side is being honest about the data. The data is ambivalent about whether this will actually change pricing for the cities of San Antonio and Austin.
To me, a very relevant comparison, rather, is Lubbock in 2024 that deregulated. And I was doing a little research going, well, I think they made some of similar arguments in the deregulation of Lubbock. And there were other factors that play there. But I asked, compared to what the prices were before deregulation and now, are people saving money? And the answer was it really depended on the rate they selected and the supplier. And you can't compare a price from 2024 to now. So it's really hard to quantify.
And you especially can't compare pre-Uri pricing to post-Uri pricing. It was a dramatic change. And you have to look at what happened since then.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that's difficult. And when you compare a city like Austin or San Antonio, right, that is regulated right now, which means that they get to take their entire population percentage, right? And the thought and theory is that that entire usage base, right, would allow them to ultimately get better prices on the wholesale market, correct? Because you have a huge book where you're going and purchasing some of this power. Austin has their own generation, so that's it's its own piece of the pie that goes with it. And then you compare that and you take that to a competitive market where you're looking at, do you have reps that maybe have more larger wholesale books that they can take to the market, or smaller reps that are trying to be competitive in that space? I think a lot of it comes down to, as you were saying, Tanya, it's hard to zero in on something, but it comes down to customer education, right? Do you have customers who are educated that have been in a retail market or a regulated market for their entire life or for a long period of time that now get introduced to, you have, a plethora of choices. It's no longer A or B, it's, A through Z, right? Which one of these companies do you want to choose? Which one of the products that company is offering you do you want to choose? And how do you pick the right one, right? Am I going for a short term? Am I going for a long term? Because when you're in a regulated, you don't have an option. It's just like, there you go. My term's my term, right? It's however long I live there. So a lot of that I do think comes down to, the education. I saw the same stuff in my research in terms of what happened with Lubbock, and it was the, people who shopped, people who paid attention, they saved, people who, just, selected were in the middle, and the people who did nothing, right? They didn't select anybody. They went to a default supplier, right? They ended up, kind of the, higher prices. But I think kind of was a wash in the end in terms of, was there savings from that piece. But yeah, it's all about how do how educated is and motivated is the particular customer that we're talking about.
Matt, today prices in Houston range from 6 cents a kilowatt hour to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Exactly saying your point, right? It's all about whether you shop and can find a deal that's good for you.
Well, look, we know none of this happens in a vacuum. So, Matt, who do you think benefits the most if this proposal goes through?
I mean, I think, we obviously want to hope that it's going to be the customers that are going to benefit the most. And I think similar to what we just said, I think if you are a customer who is, willing to go and research and investigate and understand who is offering you the best plan for your usage, your lifestyle, do you have an EV, do you have solar, right? All those things that now go into these equations. If you're that type of person who is going to do that, I think you'll be a winner there. I think the biggest winners that you'll see out of this are two areas. I think it's one, it's going to be your reps and your brokers and aggregators, right? So obviously a rep coming into a whole new market. If you look at Austin, I think it's somewhere in the range of like 500,000 people. San Antonio's 10th largest city in the U.S., right? So tons of new potential customers that you have, coming into your book. So there's obviously a big winner there. There's a whole new customer segment class that you're able to go and chase. And then on the other side of that is, I think, would be your CNI customers. So now you're going to have more options for PPAs, right? San Antonio, I think I did a really, really good job on some of the stuff that I was reading about how they went and approached large customers and really tried to build business and build kind of infrastructure plans with them. But you're obviously only going to one provider when you're doing that. Where if you can now have all of these reps available, able to do PPAs with them, if you're a business inside of San Antonio, I think you could see a lot of big winners there in terms of their ability to now negotiate deals with those reps. So, and, I think that you'll see winners across all three segments. I think, you are going to have customers that win, but I think the biggest segment is going to be on the retailers that are able to break into those new markets and really court those customers and, get them to want to switch to them. And then on the CNI side, being able to now have more negotiation power in your energy plans.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the people that benefit the most, whether it's a consumer or a business, are the ones that understand the industry and are able to leverage the additional abilities and capabilities available to them once deregulation occurs. If you know how to work the system, you can certainly save money. If you're going to not, if you don't understand it or going to just stay at default, then you're definitely going to be a loser.
Yeah, and I think Lubbock is a really good test case in this space, and I think it's kind of what everybody's looking at, right? That's the most recent city in Texas to do the same thing. Is they put a lot of time and effort, and I can't remember the amount of money they spent on education and seminars and commercials and training for customers, right, to understand what is happening when we go deregulated. What do you need to do as a customer? And they still had 35% of their book go to a default rate, right? So even though they're spending a bunch of time and effort there to educate people to be like, here's how you can lower your energy costs, the number of people that just don't pay attention, right? And a lot of that's like in the world that we're in, right? How many people are watching the news, right? How many people are reading the news versus more short form things. So if you're not, those people that aren't, being notified, hey, we're deregulating, right? And what does that mean? What do you need to do? They're going to be those customers that default, or the people who just don't care, like, well, I'm just going to see what happens, right? So there's definitely going to be, those are going to be the people who are going to lose out on those potential cost savings for sure.
35% on the default rate might sound bad in Texas, but most states would kill for that kind of transition in that period of time. Most countries would kill for that kind of transition in that period of time. Do you have a sense, this might be a Tanya question, do you have a sense for how they'll break up? Do you know if they'll do sort of the Vistra Encore model where they split the companies, or will they be more like the Houston model where the distribution, transmission, generation, and retail all stay in the same? Do you have any ideas?
I would say that, when we looked at Lubbock, it just went straight to transmission and distribution and said, I'm not doing supply. But there was also lots of other reasons that they went down the route of deregulation. With Austin and CPS, and the fact that they have so much revenue that funds their cities, I think it's beneficial for them to at least look at that route. And do they have the staff to support it? And I don't know as many people at CPS as I do at Austin Energy, but I know that Austin Energy has enough knowledgeable resources in deregulated energy and retail suppliers that they would probably be very successful at it. And it'd be interesting to see them go down that route. But I think that, either way, they do have to address the gap in revenue that comes if they have to go down the path.
Both Austin, as Matt said, both Austin and San Antonio have significant generation capacity on their own. I don't know about Lubbock. Did it have its own?
One of the reasons why Lubbock went to deregulation was it was a way of avoiding a multi-million-dollar investment in creating a new power plant. And so by deregulating, they actually freed up budget and stabilized their city budget.
Very interesting. I have a feeling the circumstances here are different. Lubbock wanted in. I think both San Antonio and Austin are probably going to be drug in if it happens. And I wonder if that'll change their, Matt, you were saying what a success rate of 35% switching. I could imagine Austin Energy running campaigns saying, stay with us, don't leave, like, let's stay with your default, be here with us, trying to aim at the other outcome.
Well, I think a lot of that's going to depend on what, like, exactly your choice. Do they become a rep in and of themselves? Because if they don't, then it would go into the provider of last resort, or they would shop those customers around. But yeah, I mean, I think that that may be an argument, Jim, in terms of how do they approach this, right? If they're being pulled into this, there could be a view of like, well, I think we do a really good job for our customers, so we're just going to become a rep. And yeah, then we will push for some of that. Hey, come stay with us. Like, let us continue to do what we've been doing for you for, the last 50, 60 years. So yeah, I mean, I think time will obviously tell. I think we'll see what their approach is to, the split up of that space if they do ultimately get pulled into this.
So, one of the things that we talked about, or at least we need to think about, is what does a successful transition look like? And, I was doing the research and you ask and you look for articles, everybody says that Lubbock was very successful. And certainly from a utility perspective, it absolutely was. But nobody really looks at it from, to me, there's three major players in this regard. If you want to look at what success really means, it's the utility slash city, it's the suppliers or the retailers that are coming to the market, and then it's the consumer. And when we look at it, for me, I think the easiest one of those is the supplier slash retailer. Were you able to successfully pass your certification in ERCOT to now start operating in these new spaces? Have you run successful campaigns? How many customers did you get? And then what does that first bill cycle look like? How many calls are you getting? Are you prepared for the increase in calls when the bills look different? So be prepared for that. Work on the education, because no matter how much education you put out, it's never enough. You're still going to get the spike. For the utilities or for the cities, I think that a successful transition is two things. One, the decoupling of the generation or the transmission and distribution from the supply. If they're setting up their own retail operation, setting that up. And then for the city itself, stabilizing its budget. So does that mean increases in property taxes? Does that mean cutting services? Because whatever the city decides has a direct impact on whether the consumer considers this a successful transition. So in some of my research of saying, well, what does it really mean for a consumer? So that, yeah, they might get a lower electric bill if they're really smart and shop around. But we all know from looking at our bills that even if we get a great rate, it ultimately only winds up being a few dollars per month, maybe 20, 30 bucks if we're lucky. But when I've asked and looked at proposed increases in rent rates or property tax rates, then they're talking about $20 to $50 a month for renters and $300 to $500 for homeowners. Well, the math doesn't math. Ultimately, the consumer loses in that regard. And I think that's what not everybody takes into consideration.
To bring some numbers into that is, I was looking at the same thing, kind of went down the same road and looking at who would be I was looking at who would ultimately kind of win on this, right? Who would save? And, I think it's like $125 million in revenue that Austin Energy brings in out of the retail cost. And I think CSP is somewhere in the range of almost $500 million, right? Just kind of the revenue cost of these services. And so definitely as a part of the transition that you have to look at is how do you successfully move that cost, right? How does an Austin Energy or a CPS make sure that when they are doing, transmission and distribution costs, and those are going into the bill, is that cost at the right level to recoup some of that to ensure that they're still able to provide the same level of service in terms of, guarantees on the lines and everything else that they're doing right now, ensuring that power is still being generated. And that's definitely going to be one of those keys, one of those tricks to, I think, on a successful transition is how do they, kind of move where some of that revenue is coming from and be able to recoup it.
Can they really, aren't they limited on transmission distribution? Aren't there some regulatory rules around how much they can actually charge? It should only cover the cost of maintaining their portion of the grid, and not have built-in additional cost for other city services.
Yes, but the prices are going up fast. Encore has made a substantial increase in its T&D charges. Reliant, I believe, is at the PUC arguing for it now. They're going up really fast. And the cities Dallas is expecting Encore to contribute some to its budget. I don't think it's the extent of, I think Matt's statistic is about right. In Austin, I think every 3 days they get $1 million from the utility, and in San Antonio, every day they get $1 million from the utility. A substantial part of the budget. If I remember correctly, in Austin, it's over 10% of their budget actually comes from this. Is substantial. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen in Dallas and Houston. It's just at a smaller scale. And I don't know if what will happen. Obviously, I'm sure if you're in San Antonio city government, this doesn't look like an appealing decision to you. But the other cities have made this transition. Dallas made the transition. Houston made the transition. You got to figure they would find the way to do that.
Yeah, I think that the biggest, I think if you're looking at it from the city, and if this were to ultimately happen, right, if they're getting pushed into this, I think the transition and how will you handle it's going to come down to kind of the people transition that'll happen, right? I mean, if we already talked about this, how do they separate retail from the transmission, generation, everything else? I mean, part of that is there's a whole group of people that are doing that. So how do you successfully transition that, whether it's finding, whether that's that company splitting away, becoming a rep, finding other places for those employees to go, or ultimately, transitioning off somewhere else. So I think that's the other part of the transition side. And that's where some of that revenue is going right now. Some of that revenue that they're getting is going to run the different retail arms of and not even necessarily retail arms, but just the energy service provider arm of the city. That when if this law ultimately passes and they get deregulated, goes away in some manner of speaking.
All right. Well, I think we can all agree this is in its very early stages and is probably going to be one of the biggest energy debates the rest of the year and heading into 2027. And I'm sure as more details emerge that we'll get together and talk about it again. So if you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to like, subscribe, and share Gridwise news with others in the energy industry. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.